macroeconomists. Welcome back. We're doing Unit 2 right now, which the official title of this unit is Economic Indicators and the Business Cycle. But really this unit is all about measuring the macroeconomy. Basically, there are three goals that we have as an economy or as a country. We want to keep unemployment low. We want to also keep inflation low. And then we also want to be increasing GDP over time because we want to have economic growth, basically. So this unit is basically all about how do we measure the economy and how do we achieve those goals that we're looking for. So this unit I also refer to as the formula unit because it has lots of formulas all inside, which luckily for this year, we don't need to memorize the formulas, but we still need to know how to use them and when they would be used, basically. So let's jump into Unit 2. There's no really key graphs. There is the business cycle, but that's not a graph that you need to graph out. This is all just text and information from the College Board. First thing that we'll look at is the circular flow diagram. This is how money flows throughout the economy and goods and services flow throughout the economy, where they go in opposite directions, basically. For example, I'm a household, and what do? I provide land, labor, and capital or entrepreneurability. In my case, I provide labor, and I go to the factor market to do that. And then businesses, or in my case, it's really government, but businesses will use my resources to make goods and services that they will then offer in the product market and then will be sold back to households, basically. And money, basically, we earn income for our factor payments, basically, for providing those factors of production. And then also we take that money, we spend it in the product market, that money becomes revenue or earnings for businesses, and then they get to keep some of it, they do get to keep some profit, but the rest of that they have to pay in costs because they have to pay for the resources that they use to produce their goods and services. So circular flow model is really more so used in the multiple choice. I really don't see it used in FRQs very often, but it could come up, so there it is right there. Okay, GDP. So GDP will probably appear on the exam in some form or another. Just remember that GDP is basically equal to output. It's just another way of saying GDP, or gross domestic product. That's what it stands for. It's the total value of goods and services produced and basically in a country during 1 year, in a given year, basically. And there's three ways we calculate GDP. There's the Expenditures Approach. That's the one you're most familiar with. That's the C plus I plus G plus XN. Also, lesser used Income Approach. That's basically adding up all the incomes in the country. Or you could also use the Value Added Approach, basically adding up all the costs and stages of production to figure out what GDP is. Actually, as economists, they actually calculate all three, and then they compare them. And if they're like wildly off, that tells them, wait, there was some kind of problems in calculations and stuff like that. But for our purposes, we mostly only stick to the Expenditures Approach. And there it is right there. So this is the most important formula you need to know in macroeconomics. It's C plus I plus G plus XN. It's also our shifters of aggregate demand. So they're the components of GDP, but they're also the components or shifters of aggregate demand when we get to Unit 3. So what is C? C is consumption or consumer spending. I stands for investment. Remember, specifically, investment is basically businesses buying capital, buying tools and machinery. And government spending is G. XN is net exports, because remember, we have to take away the imports. If it was made in another country and then imported into our country, we don't get to count it in our GDP. Remember, GDP is not about where it's sold. It's all about where it's produced. Where is it made? Where it's sold is not as much of a factor when you're calculating that. They also put a little caveat in the curriculum where they said there's limitations of GDP, and there's limitations in all our economic indicators. They're not perfect numbers. They all have flaws. They will give us some information, but it can't ever show us the full story. And in this case, there's some limitations on GDP, and that would be non-market transactions or illegal transactions are also not counted. Or the work that you do, like household production you do, that's not counted in GDP, even though it's very useful to society. Okay, labor force. So now we're getting into our first topic of unemployment. So first you need to know, what is the labor force? It's anybody over 16. You gotta be working or actively seeking work. So if you are looking for a job or you're working right now, you're over the age of 16, which I know is most of you guys, that means you are part of the labor force. My mom, for example, she retired a few years ago, so I would not call her part of the labor force. I would not call her up and say, Mom, get a job, you're unemployed. She's considered unemployed. Okay, sorry about that. I went away from my presentation for a second. And okay, let's jump. So here we go. Here's the unemployment rate formula. So the unemployment rate formula is basically you take the number of unemployed people, and then you divide it by the labor force, basically. You multiply by 100, and then that's your percentage. That's the rate of unemployment. For labor force participation, you need to figure out what's the labor force. Basically, you're going to take the entire labor force, and who is the labor force? Again, it's the unemployed plus the employed. Add those together, and then you're going to divide that by the working age population, basically. So labor force divided by population, that gives us the labor force participation rate. Okay, types of unemployment. So there are 3 types of unemployment. We need to know all 3. So let's review those right now. There's frictional unemployment. That, remember, is basically moving around. They're workers who quit or they're fired or new job seekers. Structural unemployment, that's basically people whose skills are no longer in demand due to a changing economy. Like if I was a coal miner, my skills might not be needed as much anymore. Or if I was a milkman or a VCR repairman. When I first moved to Watsonville, there was VCR and TV repair shop. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. And then a year after I moved here, it closed. And I was like, that's not surprising. Structural unemployment, basically. Cyclical unemployment. Cyclical is the bad type. That's what we're dealing with right now. Lots of cyclical unemployment due to, workers were losing their jobs, but not because they weren't working well or they were bad employees, really more so because of the decreased demand in our economy. And now this is a manufactured decrease in demand caused by a virus, by this coronavirus, basically. But because that we had to shut down our economy because we realized that we really need to be separate from each other and we can't be in close knit spaces and all that kinds of stuff, we're dealing with high numbers of cyclical unemployment. Remember, that's when the economy is sick in a really bad way. Frictional and structural are totally natural, and we're totally, that's not anything we worry about. When we see cyclical unemployment going up, that means that we're in a downward phase of our business cycle, basically. Hint, the economy is sick. So there's also the natural rate of unemployment, which isn't a type of unemployment, but it is a term we need to know, and that's the unemployment rate when there's basically no cyclical unemployment. So the natural rate of unemployment is when we add the frictional plus the structural. For our country, it's usually around anywhere from 4 to 6%, but it's different in every country, basically. You don't need to know the specific number. You just need to know that natural rate is basically our economy when we're at full employment. So when I say full employment, please remember that's not 100%. It's usually about 95%, but that other 5% tends to be the frictional or structural unemployment. So that's considered healthy and part of our natural rate. It's totally natural for people to move around jobs and that kind of stuff. What's happening in our economy right now is very unnatural. That's why our NRU, and we're not at it right now, basically. So that's frictional plus structural. We would be above that natural rate right now. So again, types of unemployment, the frictional, basically workers searching for new jobs, or if you graduate school and you're looking for a new job, you're frictionally unemployed. Structural means you need to learn some new skills. So I got a picture of a red box machine here because a lot of my friends, when we were in high school, used to work at Blockbuster. That doesn't exist anymore. I think there's one left in the country. There's not a lot of video shops anymore. People stream most of their stuff. It just doesn't make sense. We have a changing economy, right? We get our movies differently now. Cyclical unemployment is basically that bad phase of the business cycle. And so our economy is sick and we're seeing a decrease in total spending, basically, caused by a recession. So that natural rate of unemployment, remember, that's the economy is fully employed when there's no cyclical unemployment, basically. Mr. Clifford has a trick question. When we're at full employment, he goes, what types of unemployment, or if we're in recession, he goes, what types of unemployment are we dealing with? And most people just say cyclical, but we're also dealing with frictional and structural, basically. Because even when we're at full employment or below full employment, those still exist, basically. The unemployment rate when the economy is at full employment. Sometimes called NRU for natural rate of unemployment. Here is a really great FRQ. This is only from a few years ago, and this is how you can practice your skills on calculating the unemployment rate, calculating the labor force participation rate. So just use the formulas that I gave you in the previous slides and go ahead and try to answer that question. And then as always, I've got the answer key right here, and I'll try to make videos to go through all of those as well in the future. Okay, inflation. So inflation, that is basically a general increase in price level. It's rising prices, basically. And rising prices, of course, we don't like, but the main reason why we don't like it is because it reduces our purchasing power. I can't buy as much stuff when inflation's happening. And it basically means that I just have to make sacrifices or trade-offs, or I'm going to buy less of the things that I want. It's a fall in the purchasing power of money. So that's inflation. So measuring inflation, we use price indices to measure inflation, basically. There's this consumer price index. There's a formula basically where you take your market basket in a given year and a market basket in your base year. Remember, it's all about that base, basically. So we basically want to compare to the base. It's where we have the constant unchanging dollars, that kinds of stuff. And the market basket, remember, is just basically the typical goods and services that a consumer would buy. The inflation rate is determined by calculating percent change of CPI or GDP deflator. If you want to know the inflation rate, you're going to take the new minus the old divided by the old times 100 basically. So let's say I want to compare my inflation rate. Let's say from this year to last year, I would say 2019 minus 2018 divided by 2018 times 100. That gives me the inflation rate. Another thing that we need to know about inflation is just that some people are helped and some people are hurt by what we call unexpected inflation that we didn't anticipate. And the important thing that you need to know is that borrowers benefit. When there's unexpected inflation, borrowers benefit. But who is hurt by unexpected inflation? Lenders, because they don't make as much money off of their loans because they're being paid back in less valuable dollars. Savers, because they're saving money that is basically becoming less valuable every day that there's an increase in inflation. And then if you're a fixed income earner as well, because you're receiving the same amount of income, but you won't be able to buy the same amount of stuff that you were before because of that unexpected inflation. So hint, borrowers benefit because they pay back their loans with dollars that have less purchasing power. Make sure you include that if you're going to explain that about why they're affected by that unexpected inflation. Okay, nominal GDP. Remember, nominal just means that we have not adjusted for inflation. So nominal GDP is just basically how much is spent on output. It's not adjusted for inflation. We economists keep it real. So we want to know how much is actually produced, not how much people spent on the stuff that was produced. So real GDP is much more important as far as an economic indicator because it has been adjusted for inflation. Economists know that inflation is out there. So we want to account for it and we want to use it in our calculations and not just ignore it and stay blind to it. Formulas for GDP, basically, if they're giving you the raw data, you would just do for nominal units of output times price per unit. So I sold 300 apples at $1 a piece. My nominal GDP would be $300. Real GDP is taking your units of output times your price from your base year, basically. So whatever the price was in my base year, maybe it was 50 cents. Then I know that, okay, I've doubled basically not my output, but I basically just doubled my inflation, doubled my prices. Also, there's the Gdp Deflator Formula, which comes up less often, but that formula is basically taking nominal divided by real times 100. What's different between the CPI and the Gdp Deflator, because they're very similar, they're both ways to measure inflation, but the CPI only counts consumer goods. That's why it's a consumer price index. The Gdp Deflator is basically all goods and services. So it includes the consumer goods, but it also includes other goods like capital goods and other stuff that maybe consumers don't buy, like tractors and that kinds of stuff. And again, economists like to look at all these numbers. They can see how is inflation affecting consumers, how is it affecting business owners, and all those other kinds of people in the economy. Okay, the business cycle is our last part of Unit 2, and the business cycle is a pretty easy concept. It's basically the idea that our economy is on a roller coaster where we always go through ups and downs, basically. We need to know the 4 phases of the business cycle. So the phases are, you've got your expansion when GDP is rising. You've got your peak, that's the highest point of my cycle. Then I go down the roller coaster, which is not a good thing because recession basically means GDP is falling. But then eventually I'm going to bottom out. I'm going to hit some kind of trough. Or sometimes it could be a depression if it's prolonged. And that's basically the lowest point of the cycle. So at some point, I don't know when we're going to hit our trough right now. What I can tell you right now, it's sometimes hard to tell where we are in the business cycle because different economists will disagree. I think most economists, at least from the articles that I've been reading, agree that we are definitely in the downward phase of our business cycle. We are going down the roller coaster. Now, how far will we go down? How long will it take for us to expand? It depends on what economists you talk to. Some economists say that we can actually recover pretty quickly. Other economists say it's going to take a very long time to recover just with the effects, or it might take even a long time because maybe consumers aren't going to be feeling confident to spend if they're worried about their jobs and other stuff like that. Okay, so I believe that is it for Unit 2. I am correct on that. So thank you for sticking around for Unit 2, which is all about formulas. What you want to do is go ahead and practice those formulas and apply them. If you got a question in an FRQ about this, you just want to make sure that you show your work on that. All right, Vikings, I'm going to go ahead and record Unit 3 right now. So go ahead and look for it on YouTube. Keep calm and carry on. Oh, also, like, subscribe. I don't know where those buttons are, but find them. They're here right now. So cheers, guys. Have a good day. Love you all. Go Vikings.